The Chicago Bears brought us behind the scenes of Ryan Poles on draft day, and the latest documentary video the team put out shows just how well the Bears general manager predicted exactly how the draft would go for his team.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on all your favorite social media platforms at Locked On Bears, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On the show today, we comb through all that we learned from the latest episode of the Bears video documentary series, 1920 Football Drive, where they take us through the NFL draft process, the scouting of Caleb Williams, Rome Odunze and company, draft day, the decision to draft Rome and sit and let the picks play and contemplate trading up and then still getting Rome and then going through the third round and who was going to be there at 75, planning ahead on drafting Torrey Taylor in the fourth and trading back for Austin Booker. Like, it really showed how Ryan Poles was so on top of everything. He had intel on what other teams were going to do, good preparation for what was likely to happen for him, and really kind of planned this all out, and it all came right together according to plan. Not a lot of curveballs for Ryan Poles in the draft process that I think was really illuminating for how this general manager runs things for the Bears. So we'll go through all we learned from that video about the intel they had on other teams, their planning ahead in this draft process, and also what scouts said about Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze as well. So there's a lot to get into here. But I thought one of the things that was most interesting was in the top 10 of this draft. The Bears are going through trying to figure out, okay, who's going to make it to number 9? And the video shows them kind of going through, okay, obviously the first 3 picks are quarterbacks, so they kind of get past that. It starts with the Chargers at 5, really. And, you've got Ryan Poles and his staff saying, okay, they're either going to take Joe Alt or J.C. Latham, 2 of the offensive tackles in the draft. And they're like, well, they're like, this is really going to hinge on the Giants. They said if the Chargers take Alt, then maybe the Giants might trade down. If the Chargers take Latham, then maybe the Giants will take Alt. And then once the Chargers took Alt, then they were pretty sure that the Giants were going to take Malik Neighbors. And that was what they talked about. Like the video shows them talking about the different prospects that might go. They're like, yeah, you think they take Neighbors? Yeah, they were pretty sure that the Giants were going to take Malik Neighbors. And of course, lo and behold, the New York Giants took Malik Neighbors. And of course, the Chargers took Joe Alt. Like, Ryan Poles and company were on top of who these teams were going to take in the top 8 of this draft before the Bears were on the clock at 9. Then you get to the Tennessee Titans at 7, and they take J.C. Latham after, the Alt came off the board, and they took the next offensive tackle. And you could tell, like, Poles was getting nervous through a lot of that process. He was talking about, like, when the Atlanta Falcons came on the clock or right around there, he asked Ian Cunningham, like, in their simulations as they went through the draft process, like, what is the percentage chance that Rome Odunze is going to make it to us? And he said 77. What's our percentage? 77. So even at that point, like, they weren't sure what Atlanta was going to do specifically. You don't have perfect intel on what every team is going to do, but they did have a feeling like, okay, 77% chance based on their analytics and their simulations of going through the draft that Rome Odunze was going to make it to the 9th overall pick. We had heard Ryan Poles say after the draft that, he was considering trading up for it, and Ian Cunningham, the assistant general manager, was pretty instrumental in kind of talking Ryan Poles down from that and not giving up extra picks to go up and get Rome, but really trying to ride through it and be patient and kind of say, hey, let this fall to us. Again, like a 77% chance, I think it was enough for Poles to say, okay, like, sure, it's all hypothetical, but I'll ride with a 77% chance there that ultimately ended up paying off for the Bears. Because after they actually drafted Rome, you see him go up to Kevin Warren and other people in the front office and it's like, we got him for free, was the phrase they used. We didn't have to give up anything to get Rome Odunze, as though like they were very clearly serious about getting Rome Odunze and serious about trading up for him if they really felt like, man, this is something that we're going to have to do in order to get him, whether that would have been moving to 8 and just swapping with the Falcons, moving to 7 with the Titans. It seemed like the Giants, they weren't going to go any higher than the Giants at 6, and the Giants had players they liked at 6, so I don't think they weren't going to go to 4 or 5 even, but something they were definitely talking about and definitely strongly considering in that moment. It wasn't just Ryan Poles saying that in the press conference, but you've got like genuine, on-camera, filmed, candid reaction of like, he wanted to trade for it, he wanted to go up for it, but wasn't able to do it, didn't pull the trigger, and ultimately paid off really well that Rome Odunze made it to the 9th overall pick. And the other great thing from that part of the video was when the Atlanta Falcons pick of Michael Penix came in, they zoomed in on Ryan Poles' face as he turned in shock. His jaw dropped when the room announced the Falcons pick is in, it's Michael Penix. And I think it was this combination of both, being shocked that the Atlanta Falcons took Michael Penix, which was shocking for pretty much all of us watching the draft, but then also like, I think it was that combined with the realization of, oh man, we got Rome Odunze. Like he made it to us with this 9th overall pick. We didn't have to give up anything for him. Like that was still a 77% chance. So according to their, simulation. So it wasn't like a stunner that Rome made it there completely, but still the combination of a stunning pick and the realization that you're going to get the top receiver that they wanted in this draft, that really gave such a genuine reaction from Ryan Poles that I appreciate the Bears 1920 Football Drive video documentary really captured that well. Like, of course, it's heavily edited. They blur out their draft boards, so you can't see that, and they don't give you anything that they wouldn't want out there that they'd be afraid of being out there, right? Like, I'm sure someone in the front office goes through that video to make sure no major trade secrets get out, but like there's enough substance there to make it certainly informative and interesting and entertaining to watch, right? They don't edit everything. We get them talking about other teams and talking about prospects in particular. Like there's some real meat in that. Just, they also cut out, I'm sure, plenty of other stuff they recorded that they probably weren't allowed to use in this process. But to really kind of see how Ryan Poles and company sweated through the first 8 picks of this draft to make sure that they were still able to land Rome Odunze was really, really interesting. And then from there, like, okay, they nailed the first 2 picks. They had it planned out. They had the percentage right. They knew what other teams were going to be doing. From there, obviously a long break through the rest of the first round. Nothing in the second round. It's not until the third round that the Bears pick again. And even there, like Ryan Poles was on top of it. Like he kind of had a feeling how this was going to play out in the third round and then what they wanted to do with their 4th round pick. And he talked very early about trading back into the 5th round, much, much earlier in the draft than you might think. So we'll go through how well he planned out even the later rounds of this draft this year next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. It's winner-take-all time in the NBA and NHL playoffs, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 you can bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. They've already got lines out for Bears hosting the Titans in week 1. The line's already moved, so Bears are favored by 4.5 points now. It seems like the money's certainly coming in that direction. A lot of optimism. There's also lines for Jaguars at Bears on October 6th. That's I think that's the London game. The Bears are plus 1.5 as the quote-unquote home team in that game. Plus, you can bet on any and all of your favorite sports at FanDuel. So, to get your $150 in bonus bets, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's easy enough, relatively, to maybe predict the first 7 or 8 or 9 picks of the draft. Okay, like it's not a miracle or it's not some kind of wizardry that Ryan Poles figured out, okay, how the top 10 in the draft are going to go. You only have to learn a handful of teams and a handful of prospects and kind of get a sense of team needs. Like, okay. But to me, what was so impressive about what we learned in the 1920 Football Drive documentary about the draft was how well Ryan Poles foresaw the rest of his picks going. It wasn't like it was at the beginning of the draft. He said, okay, in the first round, I'm going to get Rome and Caleb. In the third round, I'm going to get Omega G, and then I'm going to get Taylor. I'm going to get traded for Booker. Like, he couldn't predict it all from the start. But as the draft went on, as they got closer to their picks, he had a very good knack for staying ahead of what was going to come and being prepared for what other teams were going to do. As they went through day 2 of the draft, through the second and third round, getting up to the 75th overall pick, where the Bears pick next after the Rome Odunze pick, Ryan Poles talked about okay, we want to go one of the offensive or defensive linemen here at 75. He said, assuming one of these O-line and D-line are there for 75, then, X, Y, and Z. And really what he goes on to say is then we can get the punter at 122, which again, he's planning ahead for the next round. It's not even that day. You know what I mean? Day 4, the fourth round, the day 3 is the fourth round is the day after the third round, right? It's not planning out for the next 50 picks ahead of you, but it's more no, it's going to be tomorrow. We think 50 picks ahead from now, who will be able to get there, and then even starts talking about Austin Booker a little bit as well. But he talked about specifically, the O-line, D-line being there, and that being a position that they really wanted to hit in this area because there was a real concentration of offensive and defensive linemen that came off the board right around the 75th pick. We've heard Ryan Poles talk about how they try and project out the draft and kind of get a sense of where there's value at different positions and say, okay, maybe I don't need to get an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman early because those guys will be there. We project there to be a number that go off the board in a different round, and it's applicable for every position. And that was certainly true, and he pieced that together perfectly for the offensive and defensive line in the third round. When you look at the third round, there was I didn't count these at the time. There's the third pick of the third round was an offensive line. The fourth pick of the third round was an offensive lineman. Then you get another offensive lineman goes about 8 picks in. O-line, D-line, O-line, D-line, O-line, right around the 75th pick. The 73rd pick was an O-line. The 74th pick was a D-line. Then the Bears at 75 took an O-line. Then the 76th pick right after them was a D-line. And 77th after them was O-line. 5 straight picks, offensive and defensive line. Clearly, he went into this draft with a sense that, hey, day 2, around our third round pick, is going to be a sweet spot for offensive and defensive linemen. More offensive linemen than defensive linemen, as it turned out. And the Bears obviously ended up taking one of the offensive linemen, but still, you had guys like Brandon Coleman from TCU, Caden Wallace from Penn State, Isaiah Adams from Illinois, who we talked about on the podcast, Cooper Beebe from Kansas State. Those guys all went at the top of the third round before the Bears picked. Then they took Karan Omega-G, Delmar Glaze from Maryland went after that, the offensive tackle. Matt Goncalves from Pittsburgh went a few picks later. Christian Haynes from Connecticut. One after the other, these offensive linemen were coming off the board. And Poles said, okay, 75 is going to be a good spot for us to get O-line or D-line. And I still can't help but wonder if Braylon Trice from Washington hadn't gone one pick before the Bears picked, if they wouldn't have taken him at 75. But we'll never know. The video didn't reveal that. But he was the only defensive lineman to come off the board in the third round before the Bears picked. Before Trice at 74, the last defensive lineman before that was at 56. It was almost 20 straight picks without a defensive lineman off the board. And so if Ryan Poles is saying, hey, we're looking at O-line or D-line in the third round, and only one defensive lineman came off of the board anywhere near before where the Bears picked, it's not impossible to guess that maybe they had some interest in that defensive lineman, especially because a defensive lineman came right off the board right after they did. They could have taken Jonah Ellis from Utah. The Broncos took him right after the Bears did, but to me, that's one of those what ifs. It wasn't like they're so mad that they didn't get Braylon Trice, but I think they were comfortable with O-lineman and D-lineman there, and you have to wonder when it's the pick literally right before, if maybe they would have done so. But even as they're planning O-line or D-line right that, they're also talking about, hey, round 4, the next day, while they're still dealing with the third round here, hey, the next day, are we going to take this punter? If the punter is there at 122, are we going to take him? He calls over special teams coordinator Richard Hightower. They're talking to their executive scout, Jeff Shiver, about it. They really talked a lot about the punter. And he's and then at 122, let's just say the punter's there. They're working through these hypotheticals of okay, we're getting Amagaji in the third round, or maybe they're trying to decide O-line or D-line in the third round and say, okay, let's say the punter's there at 122. Are we taking him in the fourth round? Is that worth it for us? And then they start talking from there about maybe we can trade back into the 5th round and get Austin Booker. Like they mentioned Austin Booker by name as someone where it's like, can we trade back in and get him, get Booker? And you had Ryan Poles having his staff call other teams and weigh the trade interest for trading back in to the 5th round the next day or the next round. It's not clear exactly what time those calls were happening, but it was a conversation that happened very early in this process, right? It wasn't like Poles was sitting around saying, all right, we just took Amagashi, we'll tackle day 3 tomorrow. We'll start with the 4th round tomorrow, we'll talk about it tomorrow. I was like, no, he's already on to the next thing, predicting, okay, I think the punter will still be there when we pick at 122. Again, that's like 50 picks after their 3rd round pick. And they had a pretty good sense of the punter being there. They thought the Cincinnati Bengals were going to take Torrey Taylor with the 115th overall pick. They took the tight end Eric All from Iowa, but they thought, they were like, man, we were pretty sure Cincinnati was going to take him. They were relieved Cincinnati didn't take him. And that's why they were talking in hypotheticals. They're like, if the punter's there at 122, because they thought he might be gone by 122. He thought since he would take him at 115, and then, they might have to come up with a backup plan there. And I don't know exactly what the backup plan would have been. There weren't a lot of defensive linemen coming off the board at that portion of the draft. Maybe they would have just taken Austin Booker there and not traded back in for him. You never know. But it is interesting how well they were able to plan ahead for that and how well they started calling teams and said, like Ryan Poles, it sounded like he was willing to give up a future 4th and a future 6th, a 4 and a 6 next year to trade up for Austin Booker. They ended up just having to give up the future 4, as far as I remember. And they even show one of the Bears scouts talking to, I think it was the Buffalo Bills they ended up trading with at that spot, and saying, like, the scout's on the phone with someone on the other team and goes, you guys got to look to the future, look to the future and get one of these picks from us. And all right, we got a deal. Like, boom. Like, they were sort of like talked them into it and helped convince them to give up a 5th round pick for a future draft pick and just say, yep, we're going to take one fewer player this year in exchange for an extra pick next season. And Poles was talking to Kevin Warren and said, yeah, we still got next year's 1 and 2 2s next year. Like, we're sitting really good for next year. We're fine with giving up this pick to go get Austin Booker, who they had already called out as someone that they wanted to trade back into the 5th round for well ahead of time. He was falling maybe a little bit in the draft, and they said, that's who we want to go out and get. I mean, predicting where they could trade in, still get him, and still pulling it off and planning that ahead of time, predicting where the punter might go and where they could still get him and having a plan for that, and then knowing that the offensive and defensive linemen were going to start coming off the board right around that spot in the 3rd round. Like, Ryan Poles was on top of every aspect of how they went about this draft. And I'm sure it's easier when you only have 4 picks and then trade for a 5th pick, but like when you only have 4 picks to really then hone in around those picks, he didn't have to spend as much time trying to predict the 7th round of the draft, because he just wasn't going to be picking around there. So it's a little bit easier in that regard, but I think it's still really impressive. And some of that's luck, and some of it's skill and intuition and experience. And I just think it was so revealing how well in advance they were able to plan out a lot of these things. And it really speaks highly of Ryan Poles and puts him in a very good light. We also got to hear from Bears scouts about what their intel brought them on Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze as well, what teammates were saying about these players. So we'll hear some of the specifics about how the Bears were able to get comfortable and fall in love with Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. If you're looking at this Bears schedule and want to get to a game, one of the best ways to get tickets is through Gametime, because Gametime has all-in pricing, so you're not going to get any added fees at the end that make your tickets cost way more like some of the other ticket sites, and you can see your view from your seat in the stadium, so you know exactly what you're going to get. I use Gametime all the time. I buy all my concert tickets on Gametime. I bought Bears games on Gametime last year, baseball games. I mean, they got comedy shows, theater, concerts, you name it. They've got it all at Gametime. I've got a bunch of concerts on my summer schedule that I can't wait to get to, and I've got those tickets at a great price on Gametime on my phone. So if you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, download Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. We know that the Chicago Bears got good intel on Caleb Williams, enough to be comfortable with him as a quarterback and a number one overall pick. But we got to hear and see some of the specifics of like what teammates said, what coaches said about Caleb that really helped sell the Bears on him as the quarterback that they were going to go all in on. We got to hear in the 1920 Football Drive documentary video, we got to hear the scouts give their reports, their scouting reports on Caleb, like as a scout, and then also their reports on what teammates and coaches said about Caleb. And there was a bunch of really interesting aspects of that. You know, we heard one of them, I think one of the Bears scouts said, you know, he's a player that's just got it in his evaluation. One of the most rare players he's ever seen. And one of the other scouts said he's an eventual top 5 quarterback in their eyes, like something super rare. But like teammates, Ryan Poles goes, you know, let's go through Caleb Williams. What did the teammates say about him? And we got teammates loved him. He was competitive. He was confident, but he backs up that confidence with his play. That he's cool and nice and fun away from the football field too. Like somebody described Caleb as always having a smile on his face, being a great teammate who pushed me every day, like pushed me to be better, held me accountable, and made me a better player as a result of having been with Caleb Williams. Like somebody said, he picked my head up and helped me grow as a person, made me a better player. Like, again, on and off the field, being someone who lifts his teammates. Like, they said that it was pretty much, the phrase he used was pretty much unanimous from everybody. On and off the field, nailing the evaluation. And I think that meant so much to the Bears. When these players are being asked this in private, they know that it's not going to get back to Caleb. It's not going to get back to any other team. It's not going to get back to their coaches. Like, it's a one-on-one with you, with the prospect and the Bears scout saying, you know, what was Caleb Williams like? And there's not really any incentive to lie about Caleb. Like, certainly you don't want to be, I can see where if you're one of Caleb's teammates, even if you don't like Caleb, like, I can see where there's some pressure to be, you don't want to come off as an a-hole because it makes you look bad if you say, oh, Caleb Williams was all these problems or whatever. Like, it makes you then as the prospect look bad. Like, I understand not wanting to come off as the jerk, but at the same time, there's no incentive to lie and say, he picked my head up. He helped me grow as a person. You could lie and kind of just use platitudes, right? You could say, oh yeah, Caleb was a good guy. I like playing with him. You know, he's a good leader in the locker room. You could say the really generic stuff, but obviously like body language and delivery says a lot there too. But like the specifics that these teammates and coaches talked about, again, backs it up with his play, always has a smile on his face, pushed me every day, picked my head up, helped me grow as a person, right? Those are not just like platitudes that you throw in there like, oh yeah, you know, he's a good guy, whatever. Like when maybe you don't like him that much, but you don't want to be a jerk, so you say something that's nice but kind of hollow. Like, no, these are very specific things that teammates appreciated about him, and to me, like that is what can put this over the top for Ryan Poles and company. In addition to the scouts saying, yeah, rare player, one of the most rare players I've ever scouted, an eventual top 5 quarterback in the NFL. Like, yeah, I mean, that stuff certainly goes a long way too. The other thing that was interesting to me was like when they drafted Caleb and then they drafted Rome Odunze, and Ryan Poles, we mentioned earlier, Ryan Poles said, hey, we didn't have to give up anything for him. We got him for free. I don't remember if it was Poles or Ian Cunningham said, we got our number one, or he just said number 1 and number 2 player, though, was what they talked about. Like after having gotten Odunze, they said number 1 and number 2 player, which would imply that Caleb Williams, of course, was the number 1 player on their draft board, but then also that perhaps Rome Odunze was the number 2 player on their entire draft board. Like, is that, they didn't explicitly state that, but when they say number 1 and number 2 player, after having just drafted Rome Odunze, it's hard not to assume there might be some, that might not be the case, that maybe he was the highest player on their board after Caleb Williams. That would mean higher than Marvin Harrison Jr., that would mean higher than Malik Neighbors, that would mean higher than Joe Alt, and any of the other players taken at the top of this draft. And that's interesting. That would be, if that is the case, which again, we don't know that to be 100% sure. We just, based on them saying number 1 and number 2 player, makes it sound as though Rome Odunze was the number 2 player on their draft board. Like, I think that's part of why Ryan Poles was so eager to want to trade up to make sure they get him so they could still get their number 1 and number 2 player on their draft board. But for Rome to be above Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors is very interesting. You know, we've heard throughout the draft process that maybe it wasn't a complete consensus that Marvin Harrison Jr. was the number 1 wide receiver, but it was pretty well assumed that everyone either had Neighbors or Marvin Harrison as the top receiver. And like perhaps you could have the 3 in any order, but we didn't hear a lot of people in the pre-draft process reporting or deciding for themselves that Rome Odunze was the number 1 wide receiver in this draft. And yet by calling him their number 2, it sort of would imply that he would be the number 1 receiver on the Bears draft board. And also, again, ahead of Joe Alt and ahead of Dallas Turner, ahead of anybody else that could have been taken at the top of this draft, where if in an alternate reality somehow, you know, like we debated this in the pre-draft process, right? If Joe Alt is there at 9 and Rome Odunze is there at 9 and Dallas Turner is there at 9, do you take the lineman? Do you take the wide receiver? Do you take the edge rusher? Like, what do you do with the 9th pick if all these players you like are there? And clearly, the Bears were all in on it being Rome Odunze almost no matter what. Like, if he's the number 2 player on your board after Caleb Williams, then it's Rome Odunze no matter what. There's no decision to be made. There's no contemplation of like, okay, do you take Alt or do you take Odunze? Well, if Odunze is clearly higher on the board, then that's who the Bears were going to take no matter what. And so to be able to have that number 1 and number 2 quote kind of snuck in there is interesting. Again, it's just vague enough that it's not a outright admission that Rome Odunze was the number 2 player on the draft board, but like it's enough evidence to feel pretty confident that may have in fact been the case. And that's what this 1920 football drive video was so interesting about. It's like there's so many little nuggets like that. If you pay extra attention to what they're saying and read between the lines a little bit, like you could pick up a lot from this draft. And I hope that talking through that with you helped. I can't play the clips from the documentary here. We don't have the rights to, use the Bears copyrighted material for that. So I, use some screenshots in the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, but like it's better when you can hear it and see it, more fully in actual video form. So I'd recommend checking that out, but I wanted to make sure we pulled out all the nuggets we could from a very informative behind the scenes video that we don't always get enough of that, I think, from the Chicago Bears, but these 1920 football drive videos, when they do it in the offseason, they really go all in. And in season, we don't get as much, but that's okay. I don't necessarily need it to be a distraction. And we'll see if they still end up getting preseason hard knocks. Then that's not off the table at this point. It sounds like because the Giants got off-season hard knocks, but now this is in the preseason training camp hard knocks has not yet been decided. So if that happens, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Appreciate you joining us, whether you're listening on Memorial Day as this podcast comes out, or if you wait till Tuesday or the rest of the week, whenever you listen to it. Really appreciate you tuning in. But happy Memorial Day if you're listening to this day of, or if you listen to it afterward. I hope you had an enjoyable, relaxing Memorial Day weekend. I certainly overdid it a little bit, but got some sun if you're seeing it in the video here. But we're back into the swing of things after the power outage last week kind of threw off our schedule. We should be back to you in your regular podcast feed every morning when you're used to it. So appreciate you hanging on. Appreciate you listening through. And of course, we'll always leave you with another opportunity to bear down.